The chamber of the High Tribunal of Zerval was an exercise in excess, gilded, towering, unnecessarily vast. The walls pulsed with organic circuitry, bioluminescent veins of authority that cast an eerie glow over the gathered dignitaries. From the center of the Grand Hall, elevated on a circular platform of shimmering blue energy, stood General Scarlett James, hands shackled in a show of symbolic control. She'd been called many things in her time, commander, strategist, lunatic, but the latest title was by far the most ludicrous. Scarlett James of the Terran Resistance, intoned high, Magister Gelrune, his voice an oily hiss that slithered across the hushed courtroom. His elongated, gelatinous face barely moved as he spoke, his three black, lidless eyes unblinking. You stand accused of crimes against the Galactic Order, violations so egregious, so appalling, that even your primitive species should understand their magnitude. James exhaled sharply through her nose, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She adjusted her stance, rolling her shoulders, an act that seemed nonchalant but was in truth a practiced motion. Her uniform, still battle-worn, still defiantly human, clashed with the rigidly pristine aesthetic of the tribunal. The murmurs of the assembled alien dignitaries rippled across the hall like an ocean wave, punctuated by the occasional wet gurgle from a species whose physiology had clearly evolved for something other than speech. They wanted spectacle, a confession, a moment where the supposed war criminal broke down and begged for mercy. Instead, she yawned. Gelrune's three eyes twitched, the closest approximation to a scowl his kind could muster. You mock these proceedings, he accused, glancing at his co-magistrates, two lesser officials, who, thus far, had functioned as nothing more than set dressing. I mock incompetence, James corrected, tilting her head slightly. And if you're about to read off the list of my so-called war crimes, let's not waste time. I've heard it before. The High Magister's mouth curled in distaste, a slow, deliberate movement that suggested he was accustomed to being feared, not challenged. He tapped the holographic console embedded in his podium. A three-dimensional projection flared to life above him, displaying text and images James had no doubt were meticulously arranged for maximum outrage. You are charged, Gelrune continued, his voice measured, with deploying biological agents against the military forces of the Zervalian Empire. James's brow arched. If by biological agents you mean airdropping fermented skunk pheromones onto your command posts, then sure, let's call it a crime. The assembled dignitaries erupted into scandalized murmurs. Some of the more sensitive species recoiled, gills fluttering, their imaginations evidently too vivid for their own good. Gelrune's elongated fingers twitched over his console, and the projection shifted, displaying a grainy recording of an alien platoon in chaos. Helmets discarded, weapons abandoned as they clawed at their sensory organs. The stench had been so unbearable that entire battalions had collapsed into disarray. Chemical warfare is forbidden under Galactic Treaty 972. Gelrune pressed. Oh, come on, James scoffed. You dropped plasma bombs on unarmed civilians. I gave your troops a rough weekend. The murmurs grew louder. The High Magister's voice hardened. You are also charged with sabotage of essential wartime infrastructure through deceptive tactics. James sighed. Let me guess. The Rickroll. Gelrune stiffened as another recording played above them. The inside of a Zervalian warship's command center, alarms blaring, officers scrambling, while the unmistakable voice of Rick Astley crooned, "Never gonna give you up," in an endless loop. A caption displayed the footage's runtime, 72 hours. The disabling of a warfleet's neural command network through auditory assault constitutes a minor inconvenience, James interrupted. You were at war with an entire species, and your downfall was an 80s pop song. That's not my fault. The crowd shifted uneasily. A few of the more bureaucratic-looking aliens began whispering to one another, no doubt wondering how a supposedly primitive species had repeatedly outmaneuvered the Empire. Some of the younger delegates looked outright amused, though they concealed it behind carefully neutral expressions. Gelrune was not amused. You are unrepentant, he said, his voice cooling to a dangerous register. And yet your crimes do not end there. The projection changed again, this time The footage showed a Zervalian convoy halting in confusion as they encountered an enormous, spray-painted banner strung across a key access bridge. In bright, bold Terran standard script, the words read, "Road closed for filming. Director, James Cameron." James allowed herself a chuckle, deceiving enemy combatants by exploiting cultural misunderstandings. "Is called strategy," she countered. Gelroon's fingers tightened into knots of restrained fury. "You mock justice. I mock hypocrisy." Her voice had sharpened. "If you're so concerned with war crimes, maybe let's talk about your planet-wide sterilization efforts on Aurelian Prime, or your containment procedures on the Arcadian colonies, where containment meant bomb them into orbitally dispersed dust." The murmurs turned into a full-blown uproar. Some of the delegates looked uneasy, others openly distressed. James had just broken the unspoken rule of this trial. She had pointed out the Empire's crimes while standing accused of her own. Gelroon recovered quickly, his gaze narrowing. "The Empire's actions are matters of security," he said coolly. "You, a rogue human, cannot claim the same." James met his stare without hesitation. "The truth isn't a matter of jurisdiction." A heavy silence followed. The High Magister took a long, deliberate breath before speaking again. "This tribunal was prepared to offer you leniency, should you acknowledge the consequences of your actions. However, given your defiance..." The lights flickered. A ripple passed through the chamber as the holographic displays around the courtroom began to stutter, their carefully curated visuals fragmenting into static. The High Magister glanced sharply at his aides, who were frantically attempting to re-establish control. And then the screens changed. Not to Empire-approved footage. Not to the tribunal's carefully assembled evidence. Instead, they displayed classified war logs. James's eyes flickered with interest. Across every screen, every projection, files spilled open. Uncensored records of the Zervalian Empire's darkest secrets. Transmissions detailing mass executions. Orders authorizing extermination campaigns. Directives labeled with the highest clearance codes. All spelling out atrocities, far worse than anything she had been accused of. The silence was absolute. A voice crackled through the chamber's audio systems, the accent unmistakably human. "You're prosecuting the wrong war criminal." Gelroon's entire form seemed to recoil. "Cease this transmission," he barked. The displays did not cease. Instead, they changed once more, this time to live security feeds of the tribunal's own data archives, where cloaked figures moved with practiced efficiency, accessing and broadcasting everything. A leak. A full-scale, meticulously planned, unstoppable leak. The assembled dignitaries were no longer murmuring. They were outright panicking. James exhaled through her nose, tilting her head slightly as she studied the unfolding chaos. She mused. "Looks like somebody forgot to update their firewall." Gelroon rounded on her. "You," he seethed, "you orchestrated this." She smirked. "If I had, do you think I'd still be sitting here?" The tribunal doors slammed open. The last thing Gelroon saw before all hell broke loose was a squad of human operatives storming the chamber, weapons drawn. And the last thing James said before the first shot fired was, "Trial's over, boys. Time to go." The leak spread across the galaxy in a matter of minutes. What had begun as a trial meant to humiliate and convict General Scarlet James had instead become the single greatest revelation of corruption in recorded history. The truth had not just slipped through the cracks of the Empire's well-oiled machine. It had torn the machine apart, gear by gear, leaving the galaxy to witness the ugly, naked core of the Zervalian Empire's atrocities. The courtroom was in chaos. Delegates, once comfortably seated in judgment, now scrambled for their communicators, whispering into earpieces, eyes widening in horror as the data feeds confirmed what had just been exposed. Every atrocity, every war crime, every buried scandal the Zervalians had swept under their meticulously polished rugs, now laid bare for the entire galactic community to see. Gelroon, High Magister of the Tribunal, stood frozen in place, his normally glistening skin dulled in panic. His three eyes darted back and forth as the holograms continued their damning revelations. One projection displayed the orbital bombardment of an unarmed human colony, a massacre the Empire had dismissed as an unfortunate navigational error. Another showed rows of frail, shackled Arcadians, their bodies emaciated, their eyes vacant, their existence erased in the Empire's official records. The worst was the classified footage of an entire planetary sterilization campaign, the Zervalian officials coldly debating how much genetic material should remain to preserve the illusion of biodiversity. James watched it all unfold, arms now freed from their shackles, rubbing one wrist absently. The soldiers who had stormed the tribunal still had their weapons raised, but the need for combat seemed to be evaporating. There would be no more trial, no sentencing, no slow, ceremonial condemnation of humanity's greatest war hero. The court had lost all authority the moment the galaxy learned the truth. One of the tribunal delegates, a Cyrelian with pale, translucent skin that shuddered with stress, turned toward Gelrune. "High Magister," she stammered, voice pitched in something dangerously close to panic. "What is the meaning of this?" Gelrune's fingers hovered over his console, his mind clearly scrambling for a response that would contain this disaster. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the courtroom's audio system pulsed with a dry, static-laced chuckle. "You know," the voice drawled, smooth and unmistakably human, "I've heard a lot of excuses from your kind before, but I think even you're going to have trouble spinning this one, squid face." James smirked, shaking her head. "Chris." A new hologram flickered to life, separate from the ones streaming classified documents. The figure on display was a man with dark, unkempt hair and a kind of lazy confidence that made people underestimate him until it was far too late. Captain Chris Reynolds. Smuggler. Hacker. Saboteur. And as it turned out, the architect behind this magnificent unraveling of an empire. Gelrune's jaw flexed, struggling to maintain composure. "Captain Reynolds," he spat, venom dripping from every syllable. "You will pay for this." Chris grinned, flashing white teeth. "Oh, buddy, you're already bankrupt." James leaned against the railing of the witness platform, her expression unreadable. "How'd you do it?" Chris gave her a mock-wounded look. "You doubt me? I'm offended, Evie. Truly." He stretched lazily, as though exposing one of the most powerful empires in history had been just another Tuesday for him. All it took was a little backdoor access, some old contacts, and, oh yeah, a ridiculous amount of snacks. You ever try hacking into a galactic government database without a supply of peanut butter pretzels? Not recommended. James chuckled, but her eyes stayed sharp. "And the security forces?" Chris winked. "Let's just say they were preoccupied." As if on cue, one of the leaked recordings switched to a live feed from the Empire's main security headquarters, where armed Zervalian officers were currently in a full-blown panic. The emergency lockdown systems had been activated, but rather than sealing off key infrastructure, the entire facility had been flooded with deafening, looping transmissions of an old Earth song. James's lips twitched. "Don't tell me." Chris held up a finger, timing it perfectly as the live feed echoed with the unmistakable beat of "Stayin' Alive." Dozens of Zervalian officials scrambled desperately to mute the endless disco anthem, their advanced security systems seemingly having turned against them. "God damn it, Chris," James muttered, rubbing her forehead. Gelrune, meanwhile, was slowly losing what little remained of his composure. His claws dug into the console, eyes flashing between the damning footage still looping behind him and the assembled dignitaries, who had begun whispering among themselves. He slammed a fist against the podium, voice snapping like a whip. "This is a fabrication. Lies. A coordinated attack against the rightful rulers of the Galactic Order." The Cyrelian delegate turned to him sharply. "Are you denying the legitimacy of these transmissions?" Gelrune's tongue flickered out in agitation. "They are doctored. Human propaganda designed to turn the community against us." Chris snorted. "Yeah, that's the problem with cold, hard evidence. It's just so inconvenient, huh?" James watched Gelrune, studying the way his shoulders tensed, the way his elongated fingers twitched at his sides. He wasn't just panicked, he was calculating, looking for an exit. The reality of his empire's crimes being exposed wasn't his primary concern. Survival was. He turned, as if on reflex, toward the Emperor's personal sigil etched into the courtroom wall. It was a subtle move, but James caught it. Her fingers itched toward the firearm holstered on one of her rescuer's belts. "Jel-Rune," she called, voice casual but carrying. "Don't do anything stupid." His 3 black eyes met hers, and for a moment, the whole room seemed to contract. His lips parted, his expression unreadable. Then he moved. James didn't hesitate. The second his hand shot toward the sigil, a fail-safe trigger for emergency escape protocols, her arm was already in motion. She ripped the firearm from its holster, leveled the barrel, and fired. The shot rang out, slicing through the electrified hush of the chamber. Jel-Rune staggered back, clutching his arm where the energy round had burned a neat hole through his robe. He snarled, tendrils flexing, but James was already moving. In a blink, she was at the podium, wrenching his wounded limb behind his back and slamming him forward against the console. The gathered delegates gasped, though none of them moved to intervene. James leaned in, voice a quiet, razor-edge promise. "Your empire is over." Jel-Rune bared his teeth. "You think this will change anything?" His breath was labored, but his arrogance was intact. "The Emperor will crush your people before you even have a chance to celebrate." James let her grip tighten, just enough to make him hiss. "You sound real confident for a guy with a hole in his arm and no empire to run back to." The murmurs in the courtroom were growing into something restless, uncertain. The weight of the revelation was settling in, and not just on the humans. Many of the assembled dignitaries had spent their entire careers under the assumption that the Empire was an immutable force, that its authority was the foundation upon which galactic order was built. Now, that foundation was crumbling. A low, resonant tone vibrated through the chamber as a galactic broadcast symbol flashed across the air. The tribunal's automated systems, high-crist by Chris's handiwork, had redirected the leak to every major communications hub across known space. The truth wasn't just out. It was everywhere. Chris's hologram flickered, his expression shifting from amusement to something more serious as he turned to James. "We're running on borrowed time, Evie. We need to go." James exhaled, then released Jel-Rune with a final shove. He slumped against the console, glowering but silent. She turned toward her team, rolling her shoulders, adrenaline still coiled beneath her skin. "All right, boys," she said. "Let's get out of here." As the tribunal chamber erupted into pandemonium, James and her squad disappeared into the shadows. The truth was free. Now came the real war. The halls of the tribunal erupted into chaos the moment James and her team moved. Alarm klaxons screamed from overhead, bathing the towering corridors in pulsing red light. The normally pristine, self-important grandeur of the Zervalian High Tribunal was crumbling under the weight of panic. Bureaucrats in elaborate ceremonial robes scrambled toward the exits, pushing past guards who were still trying to process the sheer magnitude of what had just transpired. James's boots hit the polished floor in rapid succession as she sprinted ahead, her squad moving in perfect formation behind her. Chris Reynolds, still grinning despite the situation, kept pace beside her, tapping furiously at a portable hollow device strapped to his wrist. The edges of his mouth twitched in satisfaction as he cracked through the security locks on their planned escape route. "How's our ride looking?" James demanded, glancing sideways as she adjusted the stolen plasma rifle in her hands. Chris huffed. "Funny story. Turns out, Zervalian docking codes are a lot easier to hack when their security teams are too busy collectively shitting themselves over galactic war crimes." Who knew? A streak of energy fire split the air just behind them, scorching a deep line into the metallic walls. James didn't break stride. "Less talk, more doors opening, Chris." "Already on it, boss." Chris flicked his wrist, and the blast doors ahead groaned as the locks disengaged with a reluctant hiss. The moment the passage opened, they slipped through, sealing it behind them just as a squad of Zervalian enforcers barreled into view on the other side. They wouldn't hold for long. James and her team moved fast, winding through the labyrinth of bureaucratic corridors toward the docking bay. Ahead of them, the layout shifted from opulent courtrooms to utilitarian security passages. The scent of ozone lingered in the air, recently discharged weapons. They weren't the only ones fighting their way out. The escape route curved sharply, and James barely managed to stop short as a squad of human operatives emerged from an intersecting passage. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cybernetic eye gleaming under the emergency lights, leveled his rifle before recognition set in. "General," he said, lowering his weapon. His voice carried the clipped precision of someone used to being in command, but the unmistakable edge of relief softened the tension. "Captain Hudson," James acknowledged, glancing past him to his bloodied but standing squad. "What's the status?" "Not great," Hudson admitted. "We've got partial control of the security network, but the fleet's on high alert. No way we're walking out of here." James nodded once. "Then we don't walk. We fly." Hudson smirked. "Was hoping you'd say that." Chris stepped up, still flicking through data on his device. "Bad news. Our original extraction point is compromised." "Good news. There's a juicy little Zervalian diplomatic vessel parked in Bay 6, prepped for emergency departure." James glanced at him. "And we're invited?" Chris grinned. "Let's just say the guest list's being revised in real time." A distant explosion rumbled through the floors, signaling the Empire's security teams adapting to their presence. They were running out of time. The halls twisted into a final corridor leading toward Bay 6. As the team rounded the bend, the docking platform came into view, along with a half-dozen heavily armed Zervalian enforcers blocking their path. The guards were ready. Their weapons were already leveled, their luminous armor reflecting the emergency lights like living statues of authority. For a second, no one moved. Then James fired the first shot. The plasma bolt caught the lead guard in the shoulder, sending him sprawling backward with a wet snarl. The corridor erupted into gunfire, streaks of neon cutting through the haze. James ducked behind a support beam, pressing her back against the cold surface as Chris crouched beside her, firing off calculated bursts. Hudson and his team fanned out, their precision cutting down the opposition one by one. The Zervalian enforcers fought with rigid discipline, their formations perfect, too perfect, predictable. James had fought their kind long enough to know they prioritized order over adaptation. She exploited that weakness mercilessly. As one of the guards repositioned to flank, James surged forward, pivoting low and sweeping the alien's legs from beneath him. He barely had time to process the fall before her rifle cracked against his temple, sending him into darkness. Chris, still taking cover, called out over the noise. "I really hope someone's warming up the ship, 'cause I'd rather not be here when reinforcements show up." "Then move." James barked, taking point as they pressed forward. The last of the enforcers fell beneath a well-placed shot from Hudson, and then they were through. The docking bay stretched wide before them, a cavernous space designed to accommodate visiting diplomats. The sleek Zervalian vessel was already active, its systems humming as Chris's code overrides rerouted controls. The landing ramp hissed as it lowered, revealing a spacious interior of polished, sterile luxury. Chris took a breath. Not the most inconspicuous getaway, but I'd say we're trading up. James wasted no time. "Everyone aboard, now." The squad moved quickly, fanning out as they secured the vessel's interior. James was the last aboard, stepping onto the ramp just as another set of security doors groaned open at the far end of the docking bay. Zervalian reinforcements flooded in. James turned, raising her rifle, but Chris was already at the controls. "Hold on to something," he called. The ship lurched as its engines roared to life, repulsor fields flaring against the docking bay floor. James barely had time to brace before the entire vessel shot forward, tearing free from its moorings in a violent burst of acceleration. The docking bay shrank beneath them, and then they were through, punching past the station's outer defenses and into open space. Chris whooped from the cockpit. "And that is how you steal a diplomatic ship." James exhaled sharply, rolling her shoulders as she stepped forward, watching the stars streak past. Hudson, gripping a nearby support rail, glanced at her. "Now what?" James's eyes flickered toward the main viewport, where the distant silhouette of the Zervalian fleet loomed like a hungry predator. Their escape hadn't gone unnoticed. Even now, the Empire's warships were shifting into pursuit formations, their weapons charging. James's fingers curled into a fist. "We take the fight to them." Chris blinked. "I was afraid you'd say that." She turned, meeting the eyes of her assembled soldiers, the ones who had fought, bled, and risked everything to get her out. This wasn't just about survival anymore. The Empire had been exposed. Its authority was crumbling. But it wouldn't go down without a fight. And James intended to win that fight. "Set a course for the rendezvous point," she commanded, voice steady. "We're done running." Chris, shaking his head, but grinning all the same, tapped in the coordinates. The stolen ship veered sharply, accelerating into the vast unknown. Behind them, the first of the Empire's warships began their pursuit. James merely squared her shoulders. "Let them come." The stolen vessel hurtled through space, engines burning white-hot as the Zervalian warships closed in. Alarms blared throughout the bridge, the sleek interior flashing red as incoming fire streaked past their hull, missing by meters. The Empire wasn't playing around anymore. Their fleet, shaken by scandal and exposed to the Galactic community as war criminals, had chosen violence over surrender. This was their last grasp at control, and they would not let it slip without a fight. James stood firm, eyes locked onto the viewport. Her grip on the command chair was steady despite the turbulence, her expression unreadable. Around her, Chris Reynolds cursed under his breath as he maneuvered the ship, his hands flying over the controls. Hudson and his squad were locked into battle stations, checking weapon systems that had, up until minutes ago, belonged to the enemy. "Good news," Chris muttered. "We've got weapons." "Bad news?" "They're tied into a Zervalian security lock that." James didn't wait for him to finish. She turned to Hudson, voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "How much do we need to override?" Hudson, already prying open a side panel, didn't look up. "A full system reboot would take too long. But if I bypass their targeting protocols," his cybernetic eye flickered as he connected to the ship's interface. A second later, he exhaled. "Got it. Manual control only." Chris let out a half laugh. "Well, that's going to be fun." The ship lurched as another blast rocked their shields. The pursuing fleet was gaining their flagship, a hulking behemoth of a war cruiser, now a dominant shadow in their wake. James narrowed her eyes. "Turn us around." Chris blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" She stepped forward, standing over him. "Turn us around, Chris. Take us right into their path." For a second, there was silence. Then, Chris let out a breath. "You are so much worse than the war crime charges." But he didn't hesitate. His fingers moved, and the ship tilted violently, reversing its trajectory in a heart-stopping maneuver that sent warning lights screaming. The war cruiser loomed ahead, its weapon systems locking onto them. James watched the numbers count down on the targeting readout. 4 seconds to impact. 3. Hudson finished the last wire connection. Weapons online. James fired. The blast tore through space like a comet, slamming into the enemy warship's forward shields. The vessel staggered under the assault, its defenses cracking under the unexpected retaliation. Their fleet had expected a retreat. They had expected fear. They had not expected Scarlet James. The enemy formation faltered. Confusion rippled through their ranks. But the hesitation was brief. Another barrage surged toward them, and James barely had time to issue the next command before impact. The stolen ship bucked under the force, alarms shrieking. Shields dropped to 20%. Hudson swore as sparks erupted from the consoles. "We can't take another hit like that." James ignored him, her mind already 5 steps ahead. The Empire had the numbers, the firepower, and the advantage. But they also had something else, a reputation built on absolute control. If they lost here, if they lost her, the illusion of their dominance would shatter for good, which meant they were desperate. Chris turned his head, reading her expression instantly. "Oh no. No, no, no. Don't you even." James grabbed the comm, patched me through to their fleet. Hudson stared. "You want to talk?" Trust me, she said, voice calm. They'll listen. Chris muttered something obscene, but hit the control anyway. The channel opened, static crackling. Then a voice. Cold. Controlled. But with an unmistakable edge of unease. This is Admiral Kethrun of the Zervalian Imperial Fleet. The words were measured, but James could hear the strain beneath them. You are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender your vessel immediately. James smiled. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until she stood in full view of the ship's transmitter. Admiral, she said, tone almost conversational. Did you happen to catch the news today? Silence. Chris snickered. James continued. See, I think we both know your empire isn't doing so hot in the court of public opinion. And I'm guessing those ships in your fleet? The ones commanded by officers who aren't on your war crimes list? They're watching this moment real close. She tilted her head. So, tell me, Kethrun, you really want to go down as the last loyalist of a sinking empire? Because let's be honest, you fire that next shot, and this becomes your war. You take the blame. Not your emperor, not your dead war council. You. The admiral's breathing was audible through the line. James pressed. How many of your captains are still willing to fight for a cause that just got exposed as a genocidal fraud? How many of them are going to start wondering if they can strike a deal before their names end up on the next transmission? She let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. How many of them are aiming their guns at you right now? Chris's fingers danced over the scanners. He let out a low whistle. Evie? You might want to see this. The display flickered, showing real-time fleet formations. Multiple ships had begun moving, not into attack position, but away from the Admiral's command. Defecting. James's smile didn't fade. She leaned in slightly. What's it going to be, Admiral? For a long moment, nothing. Then, finally, all units. Kethrun's voice rang through the comms. Stand down. Chris let out a breath of disbelief. Hudson sat back against the wall, staring at the readout as ship after ship abandoned their ranks, some outright jumping to hyperspace. The once mighty fleet of the Zervalian Empire had fractured, crumbling beneath the weight of its own sins. James exhaled. It was over. The Zervalian Empire, the arrogant, ruthless force that had terrorized humanity and countless other species for decades, was finished. Not in a single grand explosion, but in the slow, inevitable collapse of its own corruption. Chris leaned back, shaking his head. You actually did it. James didn't reply immediately. She simply watched as the last few loyalist ships powered down their weapons, surrendering to the forces they once thought beneath them. Then, finally, she spoke. Yeah, she murmured. We did. A long pause stretched between them before Chris grinned. So, how's it feel to be a living legend? James smirked, rolling her shoulders. I'll let you know when I get some sleep. Chris laughed. The transmission channel was still open, and in the static, James heard the quiet, resigned voice of Admiral Kethrun. What will you do now? James thought about it. Thought about Earth, gone but not forgotten. Thought about the survivors, scattered across the stars, looking for a future they never got to plan for. Thought about the countless species who had suffered under the same regime. Her jaw set. We rebuild, she said. She turned away from the viewport. There was a lot of work ahead. The fall of an empire was just the beginning. Now came the real fight. The fight for something better.